I'm an American board certified OBGYN, a mom, a Muslim, and I'm talking about sex. This is the Muslim Sex Podcast. Welcome to the Muslim Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sadaf, and this episode is everything you need to know about mindfulness and sexual health and sexual intimacy. Okay, so before I get into it, the first thing I want to make very clear is that I'm not giving any type of religious or medical advice. So if you have any questions or concerns about your health, please speak with your medical provider. And if you have any questions about your religion, please ask your friendly neighborhood religious leader. This is the Muslim Sex Podcast because I just happen to be a Muslim woman that talks about sex. So I am super excited to have on with me again the most amazing Dr. Lori Brotto, who I just absolutely love and talk about all the time on this podcast. And if you haven't heard me talk about it, that means you haven't been listening enough, because I always mention her. And I was fortunate enough to have her on before, and she talked about her book. And now she's coming on again. So thank you so much, Dr. Brotto. I'm so happy that you are here. And for those people who may not know who you are, if you could just please introduce yourself to the viewers and listeners.
Will do. First of all, I too am absolutely delighted to be speaking with you again. Jumped at the chance when you reached out and invited me on. So hello, listeners. My name is Dr. Lori Brotto. I'm a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, Canada. I'm also a registered psychologist, and I'm the executive director of the Women's Health Research Institute. So I wear different hats that involve doing sexual health research that's primarily focused on developing and testing primarily psychological interventions for women with a variety of sexual health concerns. I practice as a psychologist and sex therapist, seeing people of all genders with sexual health concerns. And then I run a research institute that supports about 700 women's health researchers and their trainees across the province of BC to advance women's health more broadly.
Amazing. I just love it. And you are on so many things. And you haven't even mentioned half the stuff you do. I mean, I know you were on, what was it, the Canadian channel? You had a show, right, of your own. And I haven't gotten into that, but you also did something with Halle Berry where you did a master class. And I saw a bunch of those ads on Instagram.
Yeah.
Talk to me just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the master class was called The Magic of Menopause. And it was really, the producer really wanted to showcase sort of the positive aspects of perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, because so often we're focused on managing the symptoms and distress and brain fog and hot flashes and night sweats. And so I was one of 4 experts brought on, focusing mostly on psychological aspects. So cognitive function and mood and anxiety and irritability and attention and brain fog, and then also focusing on all of the things that we can do to improve those. And it was so much fun because, again, because so many of my talks are focused on when things go wrong and interventions to improve when things go wrong. And this was a chance to really talk about, what that experience of kind of freeing up certain aspects of your life and what doors that opens in postmenopause. And had a chance briefly to meet Halle Berry. Indeed, she's an advocate for women's health. Feel really privileged that she was the face of that piece.
Amazing. It's awesome. So, well, let's just get into the podcast now. So you began your career studying psychological aspects of women's sexual arousal and then moved into mindfulness-based interventions. Can you share a little bit of like the aha moment of when you connected mindfulness with sexual desire and function?
Yeah. And actually before that, I was an animal researcher. So for about 6 years, I was studying animal models of sexual dysfunction. Incidentally, I was using the male rat as a model of female sexuality. And of course, this still continues to this day. It's highly problematic. We shouldn't be using male animal models for female function.
That's right.
But the view for a long time was, due to gonadal hormones, that it interfered with our ability to measure response and behavior. And it was the year that Viagra was approved, actually, that I made the switch from animal research to human research. And it's because I looking at the literature, saw number one, sexual concerns were so prevalent in women. And number two, there weren't a lot of evidence-based treatments, whether pharmacological or psychological. And so I made the switch and did that for a number of years. And then I did a psychology residency at the University of Washington. And as part of my research, I was doing research with cancer survivors. And I was mostly focusing on what happens kind of psychophysiologically when they're exposed to erotic material. So survivors, one by one, would come into a small room, they would watch something erotic, and then we would use a vaginal probe, a photoplethysmograph, to measure their body's response. And very interestingly, what we saw is although they told me and told us that they don't feel anything, that they feel cut off from their sexual arousal, that the response was muted, what was actually showing up on their physiological response was still a very robust physiological response. And so it kind of highlighted what we now know to be quite a prominent feature in women's sexual response, which is the brain and the body's excitement are often discordant or not in sync with one another. And then at the same time, I was receiving training, clinical training in mindfulness for people with borderline personality disorder who were engaging in a lot of self-harm behavior. And what I learned from my mindfulness treatment was that mindfulness could be a way of bringing them very much into the present, into their body, and that was a very effective way of helping them cope with the extremes of their emotions. This kind of idea that tuning in is far more effective than tuning out and distracting. And I quite literally just had a light bulb moment when I was speaking with a cancer survivor who said to me, "I wish there was a way to bring my brain and my body in sync." And then I thought, well, there is
Mm.
mindfulness because we're using it
Right.
with this population. And so it started out very experimentally. I invited one by one. In the end, it was about 22 cancer survivors into the lab. As I was learning mindfulness, I was going to classes. I got a teacher. I was reading books. I was, practicing every day. And in turn, I was teaching this group of cancer survivors and then measured their response before and after. And indeed, what we found is after their mindfulness practice, repeatedly, of course, that we could bring those two aspects of sexual response in sync with one another. In other words, by teaching them to tune into their body, it in turn matched their self-reported sexual response and it improved. So that was kind of the start. That was 2002 to 2004, and then started my academic appointment at University of British Columbia, and then kind of built on that, right? So that early work was very much proof of concept, and I sort of had a feeling, well, this is too good to be true. I'm not sharing these findings at all until I've replicated it at least 3 times in big samples and with control groups, and then proceeded to do that after the years. And it's been a large focus of my research ever since.
It's amazing. I'm a little bit stuck on how you measured in animals. So how'd you do it in rats? Like, how'd you
Behavior.
measure
Yeah, so we measured
behavior?
behavior. So in the female rat, desire per se is measured with proceptive behaviors. So when they hop and dart, that's a sign that maps onto desire in female
Oh,
rats.
really?
And then
Mm.
receptivity or arousal is measured by something called lordosis, and it's when they arch their back and
Oh,
move their tail aside to make room for penile insertion. And so
wow.
those behaviors, loosely map onto desire and receptivity in the rat.
Wow, that's so interesting. So, so you mentioned how, and this is just a little bit of a tangent to what you were saying. So, you mentioned how you helped patients to connect, right, between what they were actually seeing or feeling to what their mind was thinking and combine those two so they could actually be present in the moment when they're like having sex or, experiencing some form of intimacy. Would you say that's very similar to like sensate focus and how that works?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, the very first paper that I published on this entire area of sexual health and mindfulness was a narrative review paper that was focused on mindfulness. And so, what I did, sorry, that was focused on sensate focus. So, what I did is
Mm,
I went back and reread the original Masters and Johnson
yes.
descriptions of sensate focus. And interestingly, although they never once used the word mindfulness or meditation, it absolutely was described as a mindful practice, right? Because in
Mm,
sensate focus, we
yes.
encourage people to pay attention non-judgmentally without a goal in mind, just to experience, right?
Yeah.
And that when we get distracted in catastrophic thoughts or expectations, we bring the mind back. So they absolutely talked about mindfulness, but without using the word mindfulness itself.
Yeah. So, and this is just another question that I had. So, what would you say is like the distinction between the mindfulness and sensate focus? Is it that is mindfulness more about incorporating all the senses, whereas sensate focus is more about like taste, texture, pressure?
Yeah, so there's a few differences. So certainly in our intervention, we help people to establish a regular, solid mindfulness practice outside of the bedroom first, right?
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
teach them for typically 3 to 4 weeks how to have a regular mindfulness practice using a variety of different things to focus on. So the breath, the body. You can focus on sounds. You could do this with a raisin or whatever you're eating. You could do walking meditations. And the reason for that, it's kind of like when you think of marathon training, right? You you start with your 2 mile run, and you figure out how to get the right shoes and how to run in the rain and how to get your stability and work on certain things before you build up and try and do those very, very long runs, right? It's the same kind of rationale here. We want to exercise that muscle of mindfulness in these uh, less emotionally charged scenario, right? So that's and so because of that, when I developed the mindful sex protocol, I really looked at how do other mindfulness programs do this. So mindfulness-based stress reduction for anxiety, for example, or stress response. And it's the same sort of thing. We teach people how to really build these foundational skills, and then let's start to apply them in progressively more difficult situations. So what we do is indeed we first do the mindful practice using a variety of different things to focus on. And then we gradually introduce more body focused exercises that they will bring mindfulness into. So, self observation of the genitals, touch that's non goal oriented. So, kind of sensate focus for one, or incorporating these, and then introduce, if they have a partner, maybe they do some mindfulness in a non sexual but still intimate way. So, gazing into each other's eyes. And then we progressively move it from there into more sexual scenarios. So I think that's the big difference. Whereas sensate focus, of course, it's very prescriptive, right? There's the four
Right.
phases. It's 1 hour. There's the 3 stages of it, and it's all typically done in a bedroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So you recently published a paper and in 2022, and I'd love for you to discuss a little bit of your findings. I was looking through it, and so I'd love for you to share. I know that before in 2014, you had a paper that showed strong improvements in desire and arousal, and I think we talked about that before. But I'd love to know more recent research and
Mm-hmm.
what you found that kind of basically grows what you already knew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
Builds
sure.
on what you knew. Yeah.
Yeah, so, it's really important when we're evaluating psychological interventions that we think about a control group, right? That we think about what is the impact of people's expectations. So kind of the placebo response. So if you expect something to work, it works to a certain degree. In pharmaceutical trials, it's typically 30% placebo response. That's not attributed to the medication itself. And so with all of those kind of methodological factors in mind, we designed this randomized clinical trial, which randomized women who had distressing low desire. They all had a comprehensive assessment to make sure that it wasn't fully attributed to significant relationship distress or not fully attributed to the use of a medication. So, in other words, they had a variety of different causes leading to their distressing low desire. And then we randomized them to either our 8-week mindful sex protocol. And so the mindfulness group was done in person, and we can talk later about how we've evolved since then, because we're no longer doing in-person groups. And so the groups were run in person by 1 or 2 trained facilitators, and these were people who were trained both in sex therapy and mindfulness and group work. And then the comparison group was kind of a sex education control group. So not total control, right? Like not totally inert, but had some elements of education, things like, describing the prevalence of sexual concerns or what we know about the etiology of sexual concerns. And that's really important to control for factors, because we know that simply signing up for a intensive sex intervention study and filling out questionnaires in and of itself is therapeutic. And so we wanted to control for a lot of those factors. And then the other really important thing that we did is we wanted to follow women over time, right? Because what we often see in drug studies is kind of reverting back to prior function once the medication stops. And really, if a psychological intervention works, people learn skills, right? They're not just better while you're seeing them. It's because they've integrated skills into their life. And so you would predict, if that's the case, that you would see continued improvements even after they stopped the treatment. So we followed women for a year after they finished our group. So again, randomized women to those 2 groups. And then we built in all sorts of different assessment measures. So we had questionnaires. We looked at cortisol response. So morning to evening diurnal cortisol response, to take a look at kind of what happens to the stress response, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal response. We looked at sexual psychophysiology and concordance, so that degree of agreement between physical and emotional sexual response. We looked at heart rate variability, which can be an indirect measure to tell you how aware are people of what's happening in their body, something called interoception. And then, like I said, we followed them over time. And so basically what we found is, indeed, we found some improvements in the sex education group. And this, I think, is a really important finding, because not everyone's a sex therapist.
Right.
And it confirms our belief, and I do a lot of speaking to primary care docs, that, know the basics of female sexual response, be able to talk to patients about prevalence and what we understand about the biopsychosocial model, because it can work to improve some of their symptoms. And indeed, that's what we found. But we found a much more significant improvement in our outcomes in the mindfulness group. And those benefits were retained at 6 months and at 12 months. So absolutely no loss of the improvements in anything that we could measure when we measured them again a year later.
It's amazing. That's amazing. So the skills that you focused on, right, in order to teach these women mindfulness, was it, so you talk about an exercise that you do, which I actually use in your book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, about the raisin. Do you use exercises such as that increases
Yeah.
awareness and mindfulness?
Yeah.
Is that what you're teaching your participants, so that then they learn that? And once they
Yeah.
learn that, they can apply it to different aspects of their life?
100%. Yeah. So within each 2-hour group session, half of it was spent doing, so I would lead the exercises.
Yeah.
So let's say in a body awareness, I would do a full toe to head body scan. And then after the mindfulness practice, we would do an inquiry, which is kind of an extension of the mindfulness practice, where I guide them to, number 1, talk about what they observed. Number 2, talk about how paying attention like this is different than how they normally pay attention in life. And then number 3, the most important question: how is this practice relevant to your sexual concerns? And that's when they say, oh my gosh, the raisin, I noticed the colors, the textures, the explosion of flavors. If I could pay a fraction of that attention when I'm having sex, how much better sex would feel. And so it's during the inquiry, which again happens after we do the practice, that women themselves put that connection together between how mindfulness is useful for their sex life. So the facilitator never says, here's how mindfulness works and goes through the 10 steps of how. We never do that. We do the practice. And this is very much aligned to mindfulness-based practices in general. It's about do the practice and observe for yourself why this might be useful.
Love it. So, how has your research focus evolved over the years? For example, from treatment of, let's say, genital pain, cancer survivors, to broader applications in midlife and older women?
Yeah. So it's evolved in quite a number of ways. And the pandemic and the move towards online interventions and digital health interventions has evolved it quite a bit. And we're now, since about 2017, we've moved the entire mindfulness-based protocol into a digital tool called eSense. And we've been studying and publishing on it since then. And we're actually just about to launch a commercial pilot. So we've published quite a number of studies showing that you can package a lot of this in a digital tool, and women can still benefit quite significantly. And so we're now looking at, okay, how do we make this available to providers and clinics and women, et cetera? So that's one evolution. And what makes me really happy about that work is, I mean, there's so many health disparities and barriers that prevent women from accessing care. Racialized women with disabilities, gender diverse people, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on, women who can't afford treatment. And so could a digital tool overcome some of those barriers? So that's one really important stream of our research that we've taken this work. The other thing is looking at more specialized subpopulations of women. So we've done quite a bit of work with cancer survivors, so breast, colorectal, and gynae cancers, testing the same interventions. Did a few studies also with prostate cancer survivors and their partners, and then work with gender diverse women. Much more work now with midlife women, looking at, can we in our intervention also make room to address perimenopause and menopause related symptoms in that context? And then doing a bit more with other digital technologies like virtual reality. So we've got some fun virtual reality work that we've been publishing with people with vaginismus, which is like a phobic-like response towards vaginal insertion. And we've found that even a single session virtual reality can help them overcome their fear enough that they will actually go home and use their dilators and their inserts.
That is amazing. Yes. I mean, there's so many women that suffer silently with vaginismus. I had a woman that called me from Michigan. She'd been suffering for 8 years, and she, because I wasn't in Michigan, she wasn't able to come and see me. But, I don't even know like how couples stay together, right? When they've been
Yeah,
suffering for so long. I'm sure there's a lot of resentment there, a lot of anger, a
yeah.
lot of hurt feelings. And so I just, I think that would be so amazing to have a resource like that to offer to people that, suffer from vaginismus. So, for our audience of women in midlife and beyond, how do you define mindfulness in the context of sexual health?
Yeah, I mean, mindfulness is really present moment, non-judgmental awareness, right? So present moment means we're bringing attention to a certain focus in the here and now. And maybe it's something you're eating, maybe it's the breath, maybe it's a sound. And then the second part, non-judgmental, present moment, non-judgmental awareness. The non-judgmental piece, it turns out, is actually the harder piece than paying attention. And it's because we've been so well trained to
Yeah,
judge.
all the time.
And we judge when we don't know we're judging. And we
That's right.
judge during sex all the time. And we judge ourselves a lot. And it's also a gendered phenomenon. Women are far more likely to judge and judge themselves than men are. And so the concept itself, resonates a lot and has a lot of appeal because so many of us, and in particular midlife women, can relate with feeling distracted, with inattention, with forgetting things, with word slipping. And so the present moment awareness part has a lot of appeal. And then the non-judgment part also has a lot of appeal because we start to say, oh, I'm sick of all this judgment in the world and I want to be authentic and I want to have people and women around me that are, their true selves and show up in an authentic way. And I think that that's kind of a badge of armor of reaching midlife.
Yes.
Because in your earlier years, I think you're much more susceptible to those judgments, and in particular, what other people think of you. And so, yeah, the concept of mindfulness resonates quite a bit with midlife women.
Absolutely. So, why does mindfulness work, you think, with desire and arousal dysfunction? And what do you think are the physiologic or psychological mechanisms?
Yeah, this has been a real interest of mine for a number of reasons. I mean, one of them is women will ask, they'll say, "How on earth is paying attention to a raisin going to translate into me wanting sex more? Like, help me understand, doc." And so we, over the years, have also built into our research studies ways of looking at what we call mediators. And mediators are what are the things that are actually changing in the person that predict improvements in outcomes like desire and distress. And then we also build into our studies an analysis of moderators. So a moderator is, can you measure something at baseline that tells you who's going to respond well to this treatment or not? And so those are things that we've built into all of the studies. And in our work with mindfulness with low desire, what we know is there's several different mechanisms or mediators. So decreases in depression. So doing the mindfulness treatment has an impact on lowering depressive symptoms and in turn leads to improvements in sexual function. A big one is improvements in interoception, that kind of that ability to sense what's happening in the body. So we measure that both through self-report and we measure that through heart rate variability awareness. So we actually measure heart rate variability, and then we ask people to estimate their heart rate variability, and it gives you kind of an accuracy score. And so improvements in that accuracy are associated with improvements after mindfulness on desire and distress. So changes in depression, changes in interoceptive awareness, and then changes in self-compassion and reductions in self-criticism. So those are two different things that we measure, but they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So the more self-compassionate you become, kind of the kinder you become to yourself, and the less self-critical you become, both of those predict improvements after mindfulness
Mm,
on desire and distress. And so we can now say to women, look, here are some of the ways that this particular intervention might be helpful for you. And then when we look at moderators, so those are what are those things that we can measure at the beginning of treatment that might predict, and the most important thing that jumped out to me in our research, we've measured this now in a bunch of different studies, is your expectations for mindfulness working did not predict, it did not moderate outcomes. And so, how I interpret that
mm,
is that it doesn't matter if you think mindfulness is going to work or not. It doesn't matter if you
mm.
love or hate yoga. That has no bearing on how mindfulness might work for you to improve your sexual desire.
It's amazing. So, I mean, that really actually gives people a lot of hope, right? Especially those that are very skeptical about this approach and they're like, oh, this isn't going to work for me, or that, I'm not sure, I've never tried this, but I doubt it's going to work, right? So, whether or not you believe it's going to work, it shows that it actually does work.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which,
exactly. As long as they're committed to doing the practice, right? It's not magic. It's
right,
not like you breathe
right.
and suddenly you're better. Like you have to actually put the
Yeah,
time in and you
right,
have to
right,
clock those hours in the, on the treadmill
right.
before you do the marathon.
That's right. So many of our patients who face menopause, hormonal changes, relationship shifts, body changes, how do you integrate mindfulness practices specifically for perimenopause and menopausal women, as opposed to, let's say, somebody that is a little bit younger?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is we know, I mean, we've got very good data documenting some of the cognitive changes that happen with perimenopause. And thankfully, they're time limited. They don't continue on indefinitely, the cognitive changes. So, but we know that a lot of women, high rates of women, struggle with inattention, right? So
Yes.
forgetting things, difficulty with word finding, right, which also is kind of a symptom of cognitive change during the perimenopause. And then we also see high rates of anxiety, depression, and kind of irritability and mood lability, which is the mood going up and down quite rapidly. And so mindfulness, it fits perfectly with these symptoms, right? With all the inattention, word finding, brain fog symptoms, it cultivates focus, right? It gives midlife women who struggle in this area a tool that they can apply directly that's not just going to benefit their sexual health, but it's going to impact the cognitive areas as well. And then we also know there's a whole other world of research showing the benefits of mindfulness for depression and anxiety. So the adaptations are relatively minor, but if I'm working with a woman, say, who has a lot of difficulties with attention, I might focus on just breath awareness for quite a long time before we move to things that are more challenging to focus on, like sounds or thoughts. We also do mindfulness of thoughts practice, which is not thinking about thinking, but rather it's watching thinking from a distance, something we call metacognition. It takes
Mm.
quite a bit of practice to get to there. So again, if I am working with a midlife woman or any person really with a lot of cognitive symptoms, I'll repeat many of the mindfulness exercises over and over before we move on and really give her that kind of solid foundation in being able to stay focused and then catch the mind and bring it back to the present when she notices that it's taken off.
That is so, so amazing because I literally just had, and I wish I had done this podcast before I saw this patient right before the session. She is telling me, so she's 59 and she's having horrible ADHD, and she just started hormones earlier this year. And she's like, my ADHD, I just cannot get a handle of it. She's like, I feel like it's just getting worse and worse. And, what do you think I should do? Blah, blah. And I was telling her about your book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, but I'll be honest, I didn't ask her to practice that mindfulness outside of the bedroom, right? We were focusing a little bit in the bedroom.
Yeah.
And but for her, and so it's funny because I'm gonna reach out to her right after this to tell her to focus and start a practice of mindfulness and see how that helps her with her focus because she's really struggling and she can't remember and so it's been
Yeah,
really
and I would do briefer practices. I would, start with 5 minutes a day every day and then kind of build up from there.
yeah,
And yeah, because it can be devastating to a lot of women to feel
yeah,
like, I'm so competent, I'm so on top of my game, I've been able to achieve so
right,
many things in life. And now I feel like I'm going crazy because I walk into a room and I have no idea why I'm there. Or I'm
yes,
staring at a person that I've talked to many times and I can't remember their name, right? And it can be quite devastating to women.
yeah,
So,
absolutely, absolutely, and so that's a perfect segue into the next question, which is, what are some everyday exercises or mindfulness practices that we can do that are perhaps maybe even just 5 to 10 minutes long, right, to
yeah.
stay tuned into our bodies and our sexual responses? What could we do?
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the formal practices, and that is, typically with a guide. I've got all the guides for free on my website if anyone wants to download them. But there's ways to embed mindfulness in your life. So, as an example, let's suppose you drive to work and you might decide to park a bit farther away. And so the walk from your car to your office, you can actually do it mindfully. And this would involve walking slower, paying attention to not what you're thinking, but the sensations in your body and in your feet, and actually noticing how your brain is sending messages to your body to put one foot in front of the other. So that's one way. You can do it while standing in line at the grocery store, right? A time when many of us reach for our phone and distract ourselves with what's happening on social media. So you can do a mindful standing and waiting exercise. And so that also would entail maybe noticing if there's certain emotions or sensations that come up with impatience, right? Mindful eating, take the first
Yes,
five minutes of your meal, doesn't have to be the whole
yeah,
meal, but take the first 5 minutes where you take a bite, put your fork or spoon down, and you close your eyes. And you
mm,
really sense the sensations. You feel the jaw moving, you smell the aroma, you notice the taste and the aftertaste. And so there could be lots of ways that we integrate mindfulness into our life. When I speak with physicians who have very, very busy clinical practices and they say, I don't have time for mindfulness. And I always say, as when you put your hand on that steel doorknob before you walk in, pause for even 45 seconds and feel the coolness of the doorknob, feel the shape of it, the hardness of it, feel your feet on the ground, pause and breathe for just a few seconds before you walk into the room and greet your patient. So yeah, we find ways to integrate it into our everyday life.
Yeah, I love that. To your point about nutrition and mindful eating, I mean, I think that is so, so important, especially when, us as midlife women notice that we're starting to gain weight very quickly, right? And so that weight is now starting to come around our abdomen that perhaps was once on our hips and our thighs. And I think that your practice of mindful eating, and we actually, so I host a midlife retreat. I'd love for you to come to it. It's in Morocco, and but we focus on the mindfulness aspect of eating, and just really enjoying and savoring the food, so that you actually appreciate it, but also it helps you to slow down,
That's
right? It
right. That's
prevents you
right.
from overeating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And wow, to be able to do that with Moroccan food, which is so delicious and flavor filled.
well, you are invited. You are invited in September. And listen, I mean, what an honor for us it would be for you to join us, because that, I mean, honestly, we do so much mindfulness in that
Mm, mhm,
retreat, and half of it is about intimacy and
mm.
perimenopause and menopause, and the other half is about nutrition. So
Wow, that sounds incredible.
a lot of mindfulness there, yeah. So tell me more about the app that you developed. So you and your team have developed a digital tool app for low
Mhm.
desire called eSense. And can you tell us about like the origin, how it
Yeah.
works?
Yeah. So, as we talked about, as you know so well, that most women never make it to a healthcare provider to talk about their
Oh, yeah.
sexual concerns.
Most
And
providers don't even feel comfortable, right? I
most
mean,
providers don't feel
they
comfortable. They're
dismiss
not
it. Yeah,
trained. Medical schools don't
correct.
don't routinely include it. So many reasons.
Right.
And so, having studied mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy for so many years and published so many papers, there's still a lot of kind of discomfort in knowing that, gosh, women are not actually accessing these treatments. Like they're kind of staying buried in journals and books and whatnot, but aren't out there for women to benefit from them. And so my collaborator Kyle Stevenson, who's at Xavier University in Cincinnati, he and I back in 2016, 2017 built eSense, which is a digital tool. And we started out very modest with no funding. We built the website ourselves and then started doing some feasibility work to see would women with low desire use this? Would they find it interesting? And then over time and over the years, we got grants, both foundation grants as well as national health research grants to really expand upon it. It was co-designed with patients. So there's patient stories embedded throughout. There's about 65 videos that I recorded that provide a lot of the instruction, like the sexual response cycle and the mindfulness training. So all the audio meditation files are in there. So there's two arms. There's a mindfulness arm and a cognitive behavioral therapy arm. And we've published a number of studies also showing that it works and can be quite efficacious with those improvements retained over time. And what we have found in those studies is that we're able to recruit a much more diverse group of women than when we were only running mindfulness groups in person, right, in our urban center in Vancouver. So suddenly we can get women living in rural communities with, only a logging road, or women that experience lots of other barriers that prevent them from getting to a major urban center. And then we've done a very significant adaptation to cancer survivors, where we worked with cancer survivors to adapt some of the material, things like, integrating chemotherapy associated brain fog into the exercises and an understanding of how cancer diagnosis and cancer treatment impacts sexual health. Did all of that work. And now we're at the stage where we're just about to launch a commercial pilot. So this will start in early 2026. And it will be, women can sign up for the trial, and there'll be a small cost associated with it to pay for things like our server fees. And then from there, what we'd love to do is make it available to clinics. So our hope in the long term is that clinics would lease the license and then give it to their patients for free. So that women could work through this on their own. And it's really designed to map onto if you were to see a sexual health psychologist for a typical 8 sessions. So there's 8 modules, and each of those modules maps onto what would happen in a typical session.
That is amazing. And actually, while you're talking, I'm thinking like this would be perfect for my concierge practice, right? So that I could lease this or however you supply it to,
Mm-hmm.
practices. And then I forward it to my patients. And
Yep.
then, you are able to get more data, but also it's so important for them, especially because a lot of them come to me because I do sexual health and they are having issues with that. And I do sex coaching. And this falls into it so nicely. So this is something that I'll definitely reach out to you offline
Yeah,
about.
for sure.
Um, so how, what should clinicians look out for when recommending, like, say, a digital mindfulness sexual health tool?
Gosh, I mean, if anyone were to hop on to the Apple store, you'll see tens of thousands of apps and many, many thousands health apps. The problem is there is no way to know if that app has been tested in rigorous scientific studies. So
Yeah.
anyone can develop a digital tool and make promises of it working, even if there has never been an ounce of science that's been done. And so there's a little bit of buyer beware when it comes to health apps. And that was one thing when we developed eSense was we said we don't want the public to even know of its existence until we published at least 5 or 6 peer-reviewed studies.
Wow.
And it was so important to see replication and really understand user engagement and were we losing women at a certain point and what did they think of it? Did they like the colors? Did the patient stories resonate with them? So that would be something that if there is a healthcare provider, primary care doc or whatnot, recommending apps to their own patients is, just do your homework, find out who developed it. Has there been any science evaluating it? And then there's business questions like who's making money in this, right? And so those are just some general caveats to watch out for. I think apps that have been developed and tested by scientists or people who are embedded within a scientific team, those are always preferred to ones that have not been tested whatsoever. But again, can be challenging to know.
Yeah. So regarding your work with midlife women, what are some unique challenges that you noticed when you started working more with this patient population?
Well, things have certainly shifted in the last year to 2 years because women are so much more knowledgeable now about
Yeah.
menopause, thanks to people like you and others who are really bringing menopause education, women's health education more broadly out to the public. So that's been a real difference. And it's actually been terrific because I can sort of build on their foundational knowledge. I think the challenge has been, however, is if I make a recommendation that would require them to go back to their primary care doctor, and if their primary care doctor has not had a comparable, increase in their own knowledge, which we're still seeing. Sadly, we're seeing improvements. Definitely at our medical school now, menopause education is part of the undergrad medical education,
Oh, that's
and
amazing.
several of the post grad residency
Wow.
programs and
Yeah.
menopause fellowships. But that's not the case across the board.
No,
So
not at
is
all.
being able
Yeah.
to work with other members of her healthcare team who might have different attitudes about things like
Yes.
menopause hormone therapy.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can see how definitely that would be a challenge. And, so many providers are still not, I mean, I didn't learn anything. I didn't learn anything in undergrad. Forget undergrad. I mean, I didn't learn anything in medical school or residency. I mean, the only thing I learned in residency is that we gave hormones for, the smallest dose for the least amount of time. And only if women were like dying, right? Like if they were
Gosh.
dying with their hot flashes, that
Yeah.
was the only time. Otherwise, you didn't offer it at all. You didn't offer it for anything else.
Yeah.
So it was, it's only, I think, and a lot of, providers or physicians, clinicians that are my age, that are, unless they go and try to learn it themselves about menopause and sexual health and things like that, um, they're not going to get that information from
Yeah.
anywhere, right? And
Yeah.
they're still going to stick to that dogma that, hormones cause breast cancer, and they're not going to, and they're so afraid they're not going
Yeah.
to offer it to their patients. I mean, I even had a dermatologist who is a friend of mine, and she was not sure. She's like, no, I have a history of factor V Leiden. I don't think I can do vaginal estrogen. And I
Oh.
said, yeah, I know. And I said, no, of course you can. And she's like, no, I'm scared. I'm like, no, I promise. I'm like, no,
Hmm.
you can. So, anyways, and then when I went back to her, she was so grateful. She's like, oh my
Yeah.
God, I started using vaginal estrogen. It made such a difference, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I think that
Yeah.
just the knowledge, but also like the desire, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to
Yeah.
want to know
Yeah.
about such things. And if you don't, then you're really not going to make the effort.
Yeah.
And you're just going to either dismiss your patients or just going to refer them out, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. Well, she's very lucky to have you. I'd say all your friends are very lucky, I'm sure.
I'm
And people say that about me too. They always say, "Wow, Lori, your friends must know the most about sexual health."
Yeah,
And I said,
I'm sure they
"Yep,
do.
they do."
Yeah, I'm sure they do. Yeah. No, that's amazing. So were you part of a pilot in 2025, a randomized controlled trial on online mindfulness intervention?
That
Is
was
that
our
right?
eSense intervention. Yeah, so
Oh,
that was so prior to that, we published for feasibility studies, which basically
okay.
looks at the question: if you build it, will they use it? Will they come? And then once we established that yes, it was feasible and usable, then we asked the question: all right, does it work?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and then the key takeaways from that were that it does work.
It does work. Yeah. And now the focus is very much on implementation. How do we get it out there? And so
Yeah.
that's why we're going to be launching this commercial pilot to see, in a
Okay.
much larger sample of women who are not in a research study,
Yeah.
kind of your, everyday woman, many of whom are midlife women struggling with sexual health concerns. How does
Mhm.
it work for them? Do they use all 8 modules, for example, or do they find that they can just do 3 modules and they experience a benefit? Whereas in the trial, there's a lot more scientific rigor where we, ask people to use the whole thing and we check in with them quite often, and there's
Yeah.
validated measures. And it's such an important part of doing science is this question of what happens when you bring this to real world women? Does it still work? So that's the next stage in our work.
I'm going to be your first one. I want to get it right now. I mean, it's just so
Oh.
exciting. So excited. So your workbook, The Better Sex or Mindfulness Workshop, was published in 2022. So are there plans, do you think, for another edition of that workbook or book?
So I do have another book contract underway, and this
Ooh.
book is going to focus actually on sexual health myths.
Oh,
So, really kind of sharing the science to debunk a lot of common myths associated with female sexuality. The
okay.
workbook itself, no immediate plans to update it because it still works. It's still,
Yeah.
there's not much to
Right.
update on,
Right. Why change it? It's
except,
working.
except for the fact that we've now adapted this to a lot of additional populations, right? So
Mm,
cancer survivors, trans women, gender diverse women, women with PCOS, women
yeah.
with severe obstetric tears in the
Yeah.
postpartum. So we've
Oh,
adapted it to those other
that's a good patient
populations. But
population.
yeah, yeah, that actually was a wonderful collaboration with our local urogynecologists and some pelvic floor physiotherapists who wanted
Yeah.
to embed psychological skills into their own work. And
Makes so much sense.
so we're building on that now. So yeah, no plans to do a new edition of the workbook. But never say never. When as more data emerge and as we learn more about these things, then I absolutely will look at updating it.
Yeah. So, what emerging research in mindfulness and sexual health should we be aware of that's perhaps on the horizon?
Um, yeah, I mean, quite a bit. What I think one feature that I'll point out is, the populations of women that we used to think mindfulness was not safe for. So specifically, women with a history of sexual violence, sexual trauma, PTSD. For the longest time, it was believed mindfulness was not safe for them because it would lead them to dissociate, and that could be very scary for a woman if she were to dissociate in either on her own would be devastating, or even with an unskilled provider. And then research over time has actually shown that quite the opposite is true, that mindfulness can actually be a really critical tool for them to stay present. Kyle Stevenson and I have a paper within our within our eSense intervention, where we looked at the 50% of women who reported a history of sexual assault, and we compared their responses to the other half who denied a history of sexual response. And the question was, did they do not as well as the women without a history? And we published that paper earlier in 2025. And guess what? No difference. So the women with a history of sexual assault, which tends to be overrepresented in sexual dysfunction population. So about 1 in 3 women in the general population will report a history of sexual assault. When we look at studies of women with sexual dysfunction, about half of them will report a history of sexual assault. So I think it's great news that these interventions like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy can work just as well for women who have a history of sexual assault. And it also suggests that maybe instead of encouraging women to, first manage their sexual assault by seeing a PTSD provider and then focusing on sexual health, that you could actually do them simultaneously at the same time. And there may be some advantages in having, a single provider or a single digital tool that can address both. So I think that kind of work really excites me, because again, I think a lot about who are the marginalized populations and
Yeah,
the people that are not getting at. They're often the women that are excluded from clinical trials, right? You
sure.
look at the big clinical trials, and if you have any degree of complexity, they were excluded from any of the trials. So I think that's really important work.
Yeah, that is really groundbreaking. It's amazing. So, what do you think are the pitfalls or the common missteps you see when women try mindfulness for sexual health on their own or without guidance? And how can clinicians support them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few. One is thinking that it works right away,
Mm,
right? So again, you're not going to do that 2-mile run and then do your 21-mile marathon the next day. So getting frustrated and stopping before you see improvements is one of them. I think there's also maybe some myths and misunderstandings about what mindfulness is. It's not a religious practice. It's secular. It's available to anyone, regardless. You don't have to be Buddhist. You don't have to,
yeah.
sit in lotus pose with
Yeah.
incense burning all around you for it to work. So I think
That
addressing
might
some of
be
those
fun though.
myths, that would be super, especially in Morocco.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're giving me ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that that's it. And those would be the same things that we would say really for any kind of intervention, is kind of check your expectations at the door, give it
Yeah.
your all, and commit to treatment for 3 months, and then decide at that point if it worked, if it was worth it, that sort of thing. And so I would fold those same recommendations into any healthcare provider who's might be talking about recommending these tools to their own patients, is, being able to explain it in that way, that this is about acquiring new skills.
Yeah. So for couples where one partner is less engaged or skeptical about, mindfulness or, thinking that it's probably not going to work for them, how would you recommend we bring the partner in and encourage uptake?
Yeah, I often get asked this question, and I mean, and so often you and I and so many of our colleagues are seeing just one half of the equation, right? We are typically seeing the woman and not,
Yeah. Yeah.
although I do a
Yeah.
fair bit of couples therapy as well. And so, I work with the person to find ways that would resonate with their partner. So can you say, "Hey, honey, I listened to a great podcast today and I learned mindfulness works for sexual health. It could bring couples together, and there's some really fun exercises that you and I can do together that would enhance our intimacy." So you could use that approach. So refer to some external source of information. For other people, referring to the science can be more compelling. So, hey, I heard a review of a scientific study that showed this mindfulness method can improve sexual response, and here's what a summary of what the science said. So for some people, that's going to be more appealing. So really finding out, like, what is going to be that lever for your own partner that will help engage them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. And, this last question, which actually is so interesting because I get this question all the time. In fact, I got it a lot in this last retreat that we did. And it was, one of the women. So we were going to work on mindfulness with intimacy, right, with sex. And so some of the women there were single. And they were like, well, this doesn't apply. So they were actually going to skip the session. So each morning during our retreat, we have our sessions in the morning, which are usually like about an hour, hour and a half long. And then the rest of the day, so we each day we start our day with like yoga and meditation, and then we do our breakfast, and then our sessions, and then after that we do excursions and all these great things. We even had dinner in the desert, so you really have to come.
Mm.
But some of the women were single, and they were like, you know what, I'm not going to show up to this mindfulness it's like intimacy and mindfulness session because it's not for me. It's I'm single, I don't have a partner, whatever, and I'm not going to participate. And I was like, no, 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 we're going to change this now. It's going to be just mindfulness. It's not going to be for intimacy. It's just going to
Yeah,
be, how do
yeah,
you incorporate mindfulness into your everyday lives? So what do you say to that person that has the
yeah.
same kind of response to you? Like, no, I'm single. It's this is not something that's important to me.
Yeah. I mean, my first response would be to where my researcher hat, and that is we actually published a paper that looked exactly at that. So
Amazing.
the paper we talked about earlier, where we randomized women to either the sex education group or the mindfulness group, we
Yeah.
published a follow-up paper where
Okay.
we compared partnered versus single women to see
Mm,
to really test this idea that, did single women not do as well? And they did not. Sorry, they did not do poor, and in fact, there were some outcomes where the single women actually did a bit better. So
yeah.
that would be my first response. And then my second response would be, when I think about the women I see in my own practice who tell me that their sexual concern is the reason they're not in a relationship, right? They're very concerned. How do you on a first date or third date tell a person that sex hurts? Or that you have no desire, or you haven't had sex in 6 years? Like, how do you tell a person? And so there's a lot of avoidance of dating. I've had many patients that will say that they end the relationship after the third date because after the third date, people always have sex and they don't want to be in a situation where they have to disclose their sexual concerns, and so they end it then. And so I find for a lot of them, they're quite motivated to find a way to cultivate sexual response and interest again. And I mean, you and I have been focusing mostly on the outcomes of desire and distress, but there's a lot that we measure in our studies: sexual well-being, pleasure, motivation, etc. And so for single women, this can absolutely be a tool to not just improve sexual response, but improve your motivation and your self-confidence as well, because it's a tool
Mm,
you can draw from and use in those encounters.
yeah. I mean, exactly what you said. It's so funny because again, so this other patient that I had this morning, and she's been a widow for 5 years, and now she just started a relationship, right? So she's been talking to this person, and that's exactly why she came to me. She said, I'm really nervous about having sex again. I haven't been intimate with anyone since her husband died, which was 5 years ago, and she said, and now I'm just really worried. She's like,
Yeah.
because it's been so long and I'm not sure. And she's also postmenopausal. So she has all these other issues going on, and she hasn't been on vaginal estrogen. So, so she has a lot of concerns, and she has pain, and she may have lichen sclerosis. So, she has a lot of issues going on, and but she's so worried and she's so concerned. And to your point, right? Like for those individuals, and I'm sure this probably crossed her mind as well, is that, do I end this relationship so that I don't have to, answer that question about, sex later on?
Yeah. So I have a ton of empathy for that group. I mean, dating is difficult enough in the modern era. And then if you layer on top of that disclosure about personal issues, whether it's a sexual health concern or a, history of some other adverse event or something else that is
Yeah,
really difficult to disclose, it can be a challenge. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So the more tools we have to confront discomfort, and manage anxieties and also manage that kind of catastrophic thinking that often happens, the better it positions us to engage in the things that deep down we want to be engaging in.
Yeah, absolutely. And guess whose book I recommended to her before she left? I said, "You have to read Lori Brotto's book on better sex or
Oh,
mindfulness."
oh,
I said,
thank you.
"And listen to my first podcast that I had with her." I said, "And she's coming on to my podcast again." So you'll have to
Oh,
listen and
yeah.
listen to all the wisdom that you give us. I really appreciate it. So for, just a last question. So for, let's say somebody that is listening, what are some key takeaways that they should leave with after listening to this podcast? If you could leave them with, like, let's say, three pearls, what
Oh
would
my
you say?
gosh. Oh, only three. I mean, sexual health is health. That's,
Yeah.
and you reiterate that over and over through your conversations that sexual health is tied to our sense of who we are and well-being. Even if you're not engaging in sex, we still have a sexual identity. And so that's, I think, first and foremost, because it'll help mobilize you to advocate for yourself if you ever get dismissed by a healthcare provider, is remembering that sexual health is health. Um, Maybe my second point is I'm going to debunk the myth that sex ends with menopause. It doesn't.
Mm,
It doesn't end with
I know,
menopause.
right? Hmm.
And that for a lot of women, the freedom from monthly bleeding and also just the kind of self-confidence that comes with midlife and self-assuredness can be wonderful, can do wonderful things for sexual health and well-being. And maybe the third thing is, give mindfulness a try. And it's okay to be skeptical, and it's okay that you hate yoga, or it's okay to have inattention and struggle with finding people's names and why you walked into a room. But a commitment to try the practice will benefit not just your sex life, but really lots of different parts of your life and your well-being.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I there's two things that came up. I know we're trying to wind down, but there's just actually two things that came to mind really quick. And I say this all the time: is that menopause does not have to mean abstinence, and that's exactly what you said, right? That a lot of times women will say to me, "Oh, sex. Oh, I gave that
I
up
gave
once I
that
hit
up.
menopause," right?
Yeah.
I gave that up once I hit menopause, and it's as if they're like giving up smoking or something like that. And I was like,
Which they
that
should be giving up smoking. Yeah.
yeah, right. I was like, you don't need to give that up, if that's
Yeah.
something that you enjoyed. The other thing I just wanted to ask you really quickly before we sign off is that, we talked a lot about mindfulness, but you could also probably use mindfulness for somebody that, like you said, has experienced trauma or abuse, but with masturbation, right? To really be focused and intent on what it is that you're doing, and to also bring yourself back into your body, right?
100%. Yeah. And clinically, because I do see a lot of women with anorgasmia, whether it's been primary or secondary anorgasmia, I'd say that my primary therapeutic modality with those women is mindfulness, because it doesn't just put them in touch with sensations, but it addresses a lot of the judgments that come up along the way, like what's wrong with me? I'm broken. Why am I not reaching orgasm? Every other woman does. So yeah, really, really helpful skill to use with those women.
Amazing. So, for Lori, all those people that are listening to you and saying to themselves, wow, she is so amazing. How can I follow her? How can I get an appointment? Where could they find you? And do you have any upcoming books? So you said you did mention that you
Yep.
are in the middle
I'm
of.
working on one now. Yeah. Yeah. Instagram, which is a place where many of us congregate. So my own Instagram handle is just at Dr. Lori Brotto. And then our research Instagram page is at UBCSHR. So that would be a place if you're interested in participating in any of our research studies. You don't have to be based in Vancouver to participate in our research. We recruit women from all over North America and the world, for that matter. And then I alluded briefly to some of my recorded mindfulness exercises, and you can find those on my website, which is just loribrotto.com. You can just download them, save them on your mobile device, and listen away.
And when is your app going to be available? Do you have any idea? Or you're not sure?
Yeah, so the commercial pilot, which is still part of the testing phase, we're going to
Okay.
recruit about 300 women for that. That's going to start early 2026, and that's at the website esense.health. And
Okay.
so we have healthcare providers that are going to tell their patients about it, but any woman who wants to sign up and use it can just go through that website. And then our hope is around mid 2026 to actually launch the digital tool to anyone who wants to use it, and then also in partnership with clinics.
Okay. So I think that so for anyone that wants to, like, I'm so interested
Yeah.
in
So
signing up to,
eSense.health, and then we can send you updates. And when the time comes to start recruiting, we can send you a little blurb to share with your community as well.
yeah, eSense.health. Okay, amazing. Well, we are done here, and it's been real and really intimate. And remember, this is not meant to be any type of medical advice. If you have any questions about your sexual health, please go speak with your healthcare provider. And until next time, this is the Muslim Sex Podcast. So thank you for listening to the podcast, and make sure you leave us a review, share and like the podcast. And if you leave me a review, I'd love to shout you out on social media. So be sure that you share it with all your friends. And thanks for listening.